This is the questions you've asked me to answer for my interview with Lighthouse. First, I'll talk about my subjects that I taught and the goals of that class, and then I'll talk about some transformational results and community impact that I've had over the last couple years, including issues with student culture, teacher culture, common processes, curriculum depth, and then finally, personalized learning. So before I start, I acknowledge that you all asked me to write something, and instead I'm doing a video. That's for two reasons. Number one is that I will be teaching, and I'll be teaching math. I won't be doing any writing, so I thought this would be a better example of my teaching style and how I can do. And secondly, I have been trained before I was a teacher. I spent over a decade as a management consultant, and there's a quick joke. How do you get a management consultant to stop talking? Well, it's easy. Simply take away the PowerPoint. So I love PowerPoint. I've trained in it, so I thought this would be the best way to answer. And again, as I said, this is a way for you to see, to demonstrate the kind of teacher I am. All right, so first of all, the subject and goals. So most of the last several years and the last couple of years, I've taught exclusively geometry. And overall, my goal is to provide everyone what they need. That's very different than equality, of providing everyone the same thing. Rather, equity is providing what people need to succeed. And so some of my students are self-starters, and they work hard and they get their homework done. And obviously, I'm there as they need help and whatever, but they don't require as much time or effort. And some students require an awful lot more time and effort to get their work done, and that's what equity requires. And so that's my goal, is to always provide students what they need to succeed. Okay, let's talk about some transformational results I've had. Firstly, we'll talk about student culture. And a couple schools ago, or not my previous school, because my previous school is a Catholic school. I don't think there's a lot to learn from that experience, but the school prior to that was a school similar to Lighthouse, a community management organization called Downtown College Prep. And I found that there was some issues with student culture there, and the one that really drove me crazy was the fact that students just showed up late to class all the time. And to me, it's sort of like making bed. You're making your bed in the morning. You make your bed in the morning because it sets you on the right path all day long, and you show up to class on time because that shows your teacher you care. It shows you care, and obviously every minute is precious. And so when you came to my class, the first thing I did was, on the door of my class was this sign, and clearly laying out what I expected people to do, and also let them know that if they were late, I put some burden on them. They had to fill out a tardy slip and explaining to me why they were late. And here's the example of the tardy slip. It's just a couple sentences long, and I must admit that I didn't actually look at this very hard. The real key was to make sure that they actually wrote it, and secondly, to cause them a little bit of pain. If they're going to show up late, then let's make them write something down. And finally, I asked them, is there anything I can do to help? And so once in a while, people would say something like, oh, I'm always late because it's first period, my parents come in late, or whatever it was. And so occasionally I was able to actually help them figure out how to change things, but in general, it was more that. And you can see that this was quite successful. This is the results of the first semester when I first tried this, and you can see that the number of tardies I have is a little under 3 per class. Still way too many, but significantly better than any other teacher, and as high as some teachers are above 7. So when I did this and showed this data to the teachers, not all of them, but a majority of them followed my process, and we put the signs on the door, and they followed the same process, and it really did change the culture of the school. The students started showing up on time. So student culture is one example of the community impact and transformational results I've had. The second one I want to talk about is teacher culture. And specifically, I went to a terrific lecture on the California Mathematics Council, where they had this guy, a guy named Dan Meyer, who currently was the founder of Desmos. And he made the following, I saw a TED Talk of him as well, and he made the following observation, is that any math that you do, no matter how complex it is or difficult it is not designed as some sort of torture for our students. It's not designed as some sort of simply just interesting math, some sort of interesting puzzle. Rather, it's designed because someone somewhere had a problem. And so if you just teach math like this, you teach math of the traditional way of everybody memorize what I'm doing, it gets very boring. Instead, if you can explain to the children or explain to your students how this issue existed because somebody had a headache, somebody had a problem, and they realized that this particular thing that I'm trying to teach the class will help them solve that problem. And so what this guy Dan Meyer suggested was that give your kids a headache. Give them the same types of problems that they can't solve without this particular kind of math, and make them do it, and make it painful. And if you do that, then they'll actually want to learn the new thing. Because again, imagine the difference between you forcing kids to learn something like trigonometry that they have no interest in versus students solving problems that require trigonometry in a long, complex, difficult way and being very frustrated, and then coming to you and saying, hey, I need to learn trigonometry. Your class turns from one where kids are bored to one where kids are very engaged. And so I use the example of trigonometry because this is how I teach trigonometry now. And so you'll see that I started this process, saw this lecture in 2016. And so you'll see the difference between 2015 when I taught trigonometry, sort of the standard top-down way of everybody listen to what I'm saying and take notes and do some problems, versus the Dan Meyer way of giving the kids a headache and then allowing them to figure out what the aspirin is to solve it. You'll see that the number of failing grades dropped almost in half as a result of this new method of teaching that I do. And I've shared this with other teachers, and again, it's not always easy to find the headache that you can do, but whenever I can, it's been very successful for me and other teachers with whom I've worked. So teacher culture is another way that I've made a community impact. Another thing that I'm a strong believer of is having common processes within the classroom. It gives students an understanding of what to do, and they can focus on learning their skills rather than learning what's coming up next and worrying about that. And so an example of my common processes that I use is we do a lot of group work in my classes. And one of the things that I've done is I've created these things called stop and assess rubrics. So for my school, we had 3 different stop and assess rubrics based on the 3 different qualities, or the three qualities of our school. So the first one was gonus, or desire, and so I put out there what one who shows desire will show in terms of how they would act in terms of a group. Here's another one for community, and our final one for pride. And the idea is that students will, before they have group work, I'll give them one of the 3 of these rubrics, and I will ask them to read through what I would expect for an advanced student, or what a student would have to do to become advanced, and they would have to tell me what those are. And then we start the group work, and then after 5 or 10 minutes I stop and ask them to assess how they've done. And again, that requires them to go through and read this again, and then they go again another 5-10 minutes, and we do it again. The idea is that by constantly reading about what advanced would require, it affects student behavior and makes them much better students within groups. And so I've shared these with other teachers within my school, and as a school we tended to use those, and it really made a big difference by having these common processes throughout not only my class but to whatever possible through other classes. Another example of how I've made a transformational result is by changing the curriculum depth. So when I started my school, when I started at Downtown College Prep, we had some NWEA data, and here's the results of that NWE data for one of my classes. You'll see I have a tremendous spread of scholar skills level coming in. We had a couple students who were literally in the 2nd grade level, and we had one student who was at the 12th grade level, and the majority of, or not majority, the highest, the sort of median was about 7th grade level. And of course I'm teaching a 10th grade class. So this is very difficult, because how do I keep those students engaged who actually have the high school level that they need, while being able to, again, in terms of equity, giving everyone what they need to succeed for those students who don't have those skills. And so the way that I did that was I utilized Bloom's depth of knowledge, And so there are lots of different activities that one can do for these depths of knowledge. And so, for example, for a particular type of problem or particular concept, so for example, if we were looking at circles and the arcs and the chords within circles, this is an example of a depth of knowledge 1 problem. Just find the answer, plug it into the equation, and find the answer. And then, but within that, there's depth of 1, there's depth of knowledge level 1. I also have depth of knowledge level 2. A little bit more, requires a little bit more understanding, deeper level of understanding, and level 3 problem. And finally, an example of a depth of knowledge level 4 problem, where one has to deeply understand it to actually create a new kind of problem to solve this one. And so this is an example of how I have changed curriculum depth to allow a varying level of curriculum depth for our students depending on what they need to succeed. And finally, that leads into the final thing that I've done, which most of these things I've been doing for several years, but the last couple years I have really focused my time at Moreau Catholic, I've really focused on personalized learning. And it all started because I saw a TED Talk by Sal Khan called Let's Teach for Mastery. And in it, he talks about the fact that math is a foundational subject, whether that's at the highest level. So for example, obviously, we can't expect someone to be able to do multiplication and division until they can count, any more so than we could expect people to do word problems before they can do addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. We require students to, again, start at the bottom of this pyramid and move up, and it's impossible to have success at a higher level unless one has the foundation of the skills below it. And this is the case, again, that at a very, very macro level, starting with the most basic math and going to the most complex math. And this is also the case for every single class in math. So here's a map of geometry with all the different concepts and the prerequisites necessary. So the problem is, of course, how does one deal with the tension between making sure that students have mastered each of the previous levels before they move on to the next one with the pacing guide, right? It is my job as a geometry teacher to get through all the different standards of geometry, which means that every day we've got to be moving on and moving forward. How do we do that? How do we combine these two things of providing mastery while at the same time making sure we're on pace? And so what I've done is I have created a series of question banks. Each of my lectures, I pause each of my lectures whenever there's a new sort of new sub-concept, and I require students to go and quickly show me that they know that concept before I move on to the next one. If they don't, that allows me to quickly get the data, figure out who needs small group learning, and while students who've shown the knowledge that they move on to a higher depth of knowledge problem, the other students sit with me and we make sure that we work through that. I'll use an example of trigonometry again. This really came to a head several years ago when I was trying to teach trigonometry. And trigonometry is simply a bunch of ratios within a triangle, but it requires that one know the different sides of a triangle. And so one must know the hypotenuse of a triangle is across from the right angle. And I had just assumed that since we had been doing this for a while that all my students knew what the hypotenuse was. And I found that students were getting very confused and failing. And it was only when I actually broke this lesson up into very easy parts and said, okay, well, everybody has to find that hypotenuse and I will not let you move forward. Okay, now you need to find the opposite side. Great, now you need to find the adjacent side. Now you need to find, and I just went through each of these very basic steps and I found much greater success in teaching. And so now I do that with literally every single lesson. Every single lesson I have, I break up into basic concepts, and then I will not let students move forward with the next concept until they have shown mastery of the previous one. And so personalized learning is the final piece of how I've had transformational results and made a big community impact. Something that I very much would like to do with you all at Lighthouse. And I look forward to talking to you about how I can be a member of your team and help our students become successful. Thank you.